Hi everyone, so in today's video, I'm going to be discussing 4 more misconceptions about pantsing. So one of the very first writing craft videos I made for this channel, I think was when I was 16 or 17, and it was about 5 misconceptions or so about pantsing, might have been more. I will link that original video in the description if you'd like to check it out. And today I'm back with 4 more misconceptions about pantsing. So a bit of a background about me, you probably already know this if you're not new to my channel, but if you are new to my channel, I've been a pantser for almost 10 years now. I would not trade anything in the world for pantsing, but while pantsing is a fantastic process for me, I think that there's still quite a few misconceptions surrounding it, and as a bit of a veteran pantser who has been using this process for a number of years now, I wanted to talk about those misconceptions. So before we get into this video, let's define pantsing. So pantsing is to write by the seat of one's own pants. That's where the name came from. It's also referred to as discovery writing or intuitive writing. So the writer doesn't go into the story with a plan, but writes and creates the plot as they go, hence discovery. So outlining, on the other hand, is to plot a book before you write it. So the amount of plotting you do can be meticulous or it can be minimal, but outliners essentially create a roadmap for how the events of a book will occur. So with that, let's jump right into 4 more misconceptions about pantsing. So the first is that some people might assume that plotting is too hard for you, so you don't do it. Honestly, I am a big fan of respecting and honoring that writers can make their own autonomous decisions. For some pantsers, this may be true. Pantsing is a better alternative for them because outlining is too hard for them. But if outlining is too hard for them even to do and they never write their book, clearly, the process that works best for them is just to pants. So even if it's too hard, it just is indicative that outlining might not be the process for them. I have outlined before. I sometimes still use outlines, but most of the time outlining an entire novel before I start it just doesn't work for me. I tried this before, and what ended up happening is I had this outline that I worked on for years, and then I never wrote the book. I wish I had spent the time that I was outlining writing the book. I'm sure that some outliners have outlines that they don't end up using, but for me, I wish instead of trying to perfect the story before I wrote it, and I'm not saying that that's what outliners do, that's just what I was doing when I was outlining. I wish I had spent more of that time writing, and I could have had another book instead of an outline to read, for example. So in general, not all writers are going to work in the same way because we're all unique people. So I like to think of it this way, that plotting is not a requirement to write a great book, just like pantsing isn't a requirement to write a great book. Pantsing is essentially a synonym for spontaneity. Outlining, which is plotting, both could be great skills for everybody to use. I use reverse outlining all the time if that's most helpful for me. Sometimes I still do outline my scenes. It's rare, but sometimes I do. Oftentimes when I'm writing, I'll have an idea of the next thing that I need to write kind of intuitively. And for example, outliners might have a spontaneous new scene or a line of dialogue they weren't planning for that changes something in their story. I think incorporating both, if that works for you, is great. So the next misconception is that pantsers don't ever follow a story structure. I don't know if this is a spicy take, but what if I said that I feel like it's possible to do this while you write the book and not before you write the book? For example, oftentimes I do create or follow story structures while pantsing. A lot of the times that happens in my short fiction. It even happens sometimes in my chapters. But I have created structures for myself that I keep in mind as I write, or even better, I keep in mind these structures when I edit. I'm not so concerned about them when I write. And often because I have been writing for so many years, it's kind of like instinct. The stories will follow a structure that I didn't even intend. So I don't necessarily need to follow a structure before I start writing. I recently saw something online. It was somewhere, and I think it was well-intentioned. Somebody was essentially saying that like pantsing is just bound to failure. I was so surprised to see it in 2022. I was like, well, this opinion in our day of 2022 is kind of outdated. And essentially, I think they were talking about all the points, but especially story structure and how like pantsers will eventually just ultimately fail. No matter what you do, you can't even try. If you're a pantser, you're just gonna fuck it up in your book. And I don't think that we need to bash processes in order to uplift another. And I genuinely think that pantsers, for example, like me, we put a lot of effort into learning our craft and what works for our craft. I respect the crap out of outliners, but it's just not how my brain brain works. And humans have so many different ways of thinking that we can't possibly expect everybody to be able to write a book the exact same way and follow the exact same process. So in my experience, you can definitely follow a story structure intuitively in your mind alone. Some people really rely on and thrive when they follow their instincts. And I think pantsers are those people. And those instincts may actually follow a story structure. And this is how I write most of the time. And that's not to say that pantsers will never need to revise their story structures, but the same thing goes for outliners. Sometimes you might have mistaken a beat for another when you weren't planning, or you may have misplaced something. You may need to add something. An outline, and again, I don't know if this is spicy take, I don't think an outline is infallible. In my original video, I talked about how outlining and pantsing are essentially the exact same thing, but outlining is essentially just pantsing before you write, because outliners have to come up with those ideas from somewhere, and they just so happen to organize them before they write. But when I write those ideas as they come. But it's essentially the exact same process. One person brainstorms before and one person brainstorms during, but you both still use the process of brainstorming. So the third misconception I have today is that outlining is the only way to get better at writing. Honestly, I feel like as a pantser, outlining won't make me a better writer because I'm not an outliner. That's just how my personal process works and how my brain functions in terms of its creativity. This is kind of like saying that sketching first is the only possible way of creating a great painting. Also, I write worse when I outline most of the time. Is a reason why I'm so jealous of outliners, because I wish that I could just write well when I outline, but I just can't. I feel like it would make my life so much easier if I could write well with an outline, but I don't write well at all when I outline. My writing is dull. It's very choppy. It's play by play. It's not immersive like it is when I pants, and I genuinely wish that was different. Outlining is a tool that some writers love, and that helps some writers create a first draft. And when I'm talking about outlining, I'm usually just discussing outlining to write like a first draft. But it is a tool, and at the end of the day, not everybody needs that certain tool or likes to use a certain tool. Some people will find that tool helpful, some people will not find it necessary. So when we treat outlining as a tool, we see it as less intrinsic to writing, but more intrinsic to a certain process. And not everyone follows the same process. You don't have to be an outliner in order to be a writer. But if you like outlining for your process, you found your process. So the last misconception about pantsing is that pantsing is something you graduate from, or that it's a bit unprofessional. I did this a lot when I outlined that book that I never ended up writing, that I just wish I wrote. Instead of being afraid that I wouldn't write it properly, I kept telling myself, eventually I'll be a good enough writer to outline. Eventually, when I learn how to outline a book before I draft it, I will be a published writer, and this book will be something I'm very proud of. I had loved the idea for this book so much, and I didn't want to screw it up as a bad writer who didn't know how to outline, and I felt like I eventually needed to make the step up to outlining. I constantly told myself that, and I realized it's just not true. So getting published has nothing to do with how you wrote the story or the book. Getting published has something to do with the story or the book. It doesn't have to do with the process. Do you know how your favorite writers wrote their book? I have no idea how a majority of those writers wrote those books. I have no clue if most of them pants them or if most of them outline them, because you can't tell that from the quality of a book. And some people might argue with me and they'd be like, oh, well, you can tell if somebody followed a story structure, but then I say kind of refer to the earlier point that you can follow a story structure. And of course, when you're in revisions, you're likely going to follow a story structure when you're revising. Those writers publish those books because they found a process that worked best for them, not because they were trying to force themselves into a process they thought was correct, which I did a lot, especially when I was a younger writer. However you went about writing your book, it's none of my business. I don't care as long as it worked for you. So those are the 4 misconceptions I sometimes hear about pantsing. I want to talk about this more because it's something I'm really passionate about, especially if I have a younger audience. If you're still trying to find yourself as a writer, your process as a writer, you don't gotta listen to anybody who's telling you you have to do something. Part of being a good writer is learning what works best for you. So if you're a pantser, what are a couple more misconceptions you yourself had about pantsing, or that you've seen other people have about pantsing? Leave them in the comments. But for now, do something spontaneous in your book, and I will see you in another video. Bye.